They said we were too fragile for the stars. They said humanity would never survive because we cared too much, because we felt too deeply, because we buried our dead while others melted theirs down for fuel. They looked at us and they saw sentiment, not strength, but that was because they never understood what mourning really means. They never understood that when a human soldier falls, it is not just the end of a life, it is the beginning of memory, and memory is more dangerous than any weapon. The valley on Kairos 8 was scarred by fire and bone and lost. The sky overhead was smeared in smoke and the color of dying light, but on that field the survivors of the 13th Battalion stood side by side, boots planted in ash and grief, and their hands were not rifles but shovels, scratched and dented and old but steady. They dug with those shovels into the cracked and scorched earth, not to escape, not to hide, but to make room to remember. They laid down their dead one by one in rows, lined not by rank but by the weight of sacrifice. Some still clutched photos of families, folded paper, letters, ration tokens, medals from older wars. Each body was lowered with hands, not machines, and each was covered in earth as if sealing a vow. With every shovelful the wind carried the smell of plasma and blood, but also something else, something quiet and sacred. Collier Riven was the last to kneel. She was the medic, the one who had said no soldier would die alone, not while she breathed, and she had kept that promise until the very end. Her hands trembled, but only a little, as she placed a field tag on the chest of a corporal barely 20, his eyes still open but empty. She brushed them closed, then whispered something no one else could hear and stood to rejoin the line, and that was when the first shot came. No one saw where it came from, but it struck Collier in the back and tore through her chest. Before anyone could speak she fell forward and did not rise. The second shot hit the chaplain square inches the ribs. He was still holding his prayer book when he collapsed. The third and fourth shots scattered the squad, not enough to fight back, just enough to destroy the moment, to desecrate the silence and the soldiers on the ridge who fired those shots. They laughed, their helmets open, their faces sneering. They called us weak, said we were wasting time, said the dead meant nothing in a war that never ended. They filmed us from behind high-resolution feeds broadcasting across Dominion space with commentary mocking the idea of dirt funerals and field prayers. They did not even bother to reload. They just left smirking like they had done something clever, but they did not realize what they had just done, because it was not the deaths that broke us, it was the disrespect, it was the mockery of our memory, and that was a cost we would never let go unpaid. The surviving squad did not scream, did not curse. They picked Collier up gently, what was left of her, and laid her in the same grave she was digging. They finished the burial without a word, then marked it with her medic's insignia pressed into the dirt, and the squad stood there under the wind and the broken light, and they did not cry, they did not pray, they just memorized every detail, the shape of the ridge, the sound of the laughter, the exact coordinates, because something inside them had shifted, something beyond rage, something older than vengeance and far more focused, and the footage leaked faster than anyone could contain it. Someone uploaded the raw helmet cam from one of the soldiers, still recording every breath, every shout, every second of silence, and every second of horror. The galaxy saw it all, and for the first time in years the neutral systems paused. Even some Dominion citizens watched in silence. They waited for Earth to speak, to condemn, to threaten, to retaliate, but Earth said nothing, not officially, not publicly, but the silence was not ignorance, it was intention. Border posts began going offline, human colonies closed transmission lines, diplomatic channels shut down without notice, and then the fleets vanished from all tracking systems. Defense satellites stopped pinging, navigation beacons fell silent, and no one could say why. No declarations, no warnings, no sudden show of power, just absence. Absence that felt like pressure, absence that felt like waiting. And beneath the Atlantic Ocean, in a chamber deeper than any civilian satellite had ever mapped, a single file was opened, a protocol known only to a handful of ghosts. Mirafall. It was tied to one condition and one alone: the confirmed death of Collier Riven, daughter of Admiral Sarah Riven, the man who had built the last invisible fleet, the man whose name was erased not because he failed but because he had succeeded to. Well, Collier's death unlocked a chain of systems buried for decades, and those systems activated without hesitation. Black site orders were issued to units that no longer existed on paper. Names that had been removed from command rosters began to resurface, but not in public, not in broadcasts, only in deletion logs, only in records of Dominion officers who were suddenly unreachable, outposts that stopped responding without Istrus calls supply convoys that arrived to find their stations abandoned. Only one trace was ever left behind, a shovel marked into steel, a field tag charred into a bulkhead, a message scratched into the wall, an old Earth script we remember, and the soldiers from Kairos 8 who lived through that day. They were never seen again, not in uniform, not in records, but their work became legend. They moved not in groups but as ghosts, as symbols. They never spoke, they never claimed credit, they did not leave witnesses, they left signs that said Earth is watching, signs that said this is what memory looks like. And as the Dominion tried to spin it, tried to erase it, tried to laugh again, they found they could not, because now their own people whisper the name, the gravediggers, and those whispers traveled farther than any order could, and so the silence that Earth had kept so tightly suddenly sounded louder than any war cry, because it said, we do not forget and we do not forgive. And now you have seen what comes after we bury our dead. They tried to measure our silence, but they used the wrong scale. They thought if Earth did not respond with fleets, if it did not fill the skies with fire, if it did not scream across the void, then it meant we were afraid. They thought if we were quiet, we were defeated. But what they failed to understand is that silence from humanity is never empty. Silence is waiting, silence is preparation, silence is a blade being sharpened in the dark. And what the Dominion thought was surrender was a storm that had not yet opened its eyes. After Kairos 8, Earth vanished from the conversation, not because we were hiding but because we were listening. Every embassy locked its doors, every civilian transport changed course, human outposts along the neutral zones began going dark, some powered down, some simply disappeared. Entire cities turned cold overnight without a single shot fired, and still no one could explain it. No one in the public, no one in the press, no one even in high command of our so-called allies. Even they were kept in the dark because this was not their war, not anymore. This was personal, and personal wars are the most dangerous of all. The first time someone noticed something was wrong, they were aboard a Dominion patrol ship just outside the Calix corridor. Their cargo was late, and the supply station they were headed for was not answering hails. Standard procedure. They sent a drone in. The feed came back with no signs of damage, no signs of battle. The lights were on, the reactor was lit, but every room was empty. The mess hall, half-eaten meals still warm, bunks unmade, weapons in racks undisturbed, a ghost town in space. On the control deck, one phrase had been carved into the wall with the edge of a combat knife, a single word, remember. The footage was flagged by Dominion intelligence and sealed immediately. No public mention, no warning. But the same thing happened again 4 days later on another station in a different sector, and then again and again. All silent, all clean, no blood, no bodies, just absence, and always the same mark, scratched, burned, welded. We remember at first the Dominion called it coincidence, then sabotage, then pirates, then maternal treason, but nothing made sense because nothing had ever moved like this. No pattern, no signal, no trace, just consequence. And by the time they admitted something was wrong, by the time they whispered the word retaliation, it was too late. Earth had not declared war, but it no longer needed to. It was already happening, not through official orders but through memory, through ghosts, through soldiers who no longer existed in any database, who answered to nothing except the promise made in the ash of Kairos 8. The squad that survived had become something more than a unit. They had become the sharp edge of grief forged in the dirt and fire of betrayal. They had no command, no backup. They did not take prisoners. They did not destroy everything, just the right things, the important things. And the Dominion began to feel it not as fear but as erosion. Their borders no longer secure, their logistics unreliable, their lower officers requesting transfers to less visible posts, and above all their silence, the same silence they once mocked, now hung over their halls like a shadow. Every officer, every commander, every council member began to question which of their words would be heard by the wrong ears, which of their orders would draw the attention of the watchers in the dark. No one knew what the gravediggers looked like anymore, not even other humans, but their work always looked the same, clean, fast, irreversible, the kind of precision that speaks of purpose, not vengeance. This was not rage, it was ritual, it was the fulfillment of something sacred. And as more Dominion structures went dark without violence, just abandonment, a different kind of fear took root, the fear of being seen, the fear of being remembered. Newsfeeds tried to spin it. Earth had lost control, Earth was broken, Earth was sabotaging itself, but the people watching knew better, because the footage from Kairos 8 had never been officially released, but it had been seen. Millions of views reshared and secret forums played on silent loops in bars and quarters and bunkers across dozens of worlds. Kalia Riven had become a symbol not of peace, not of hope, but of cost. The cost of crossing the line, the cost of mocking the dead. And people remembered, and when people remember long enough they choose sides, not with flags but with their hearts. And quietly across the neutral systems there was movement, unregistered ships changing course, unaligned freighters offering supplies, and branded technicians delivering repairs to damaged human comm towers. No questions asked, no payment needed, just quiet acknowledgement that some things are worth standing with even in silence. And the Dominion began to fracture, not through war but through doubt. Their own citizens leaking information, their own pilots disappearing, their own officers refusing to speak certain names out loud because they knew that somewhere someone was listening, and Earth still said nothing. Not a single broadcast, not a single command. It let the silence do the talking, because say by now that silence had a voice, and it was louder than any declaration, louder than any fleet, louder than any flag. The silence said, we remember. The silence said, you made a mistake, and now we are writing it into history line by line, without mercy, without pause, without forgiveness. And as the Dominion Council convened behind closed doors, as analysts scrambled for explanations and generals drafted plans, none of them noticed that one of their own was already missing, not resigned, not killed, simply gone from every database. Her last recorded transmission had ended with the whisper, too quiet to translate, but the translator marked it as human origin and attached one word as context: gravediggers. They were not supposed to survive. Kairos 8 was supposed to be their grave, and yet they did survive. Not all of them, but enough. 3 soldiers, 1 broken ship, no orders, no oversight, no name. They left the battlefield not to escape but to become something else, no longer part of any known fleet, no longer bound by any flag. They drifted from system to system, following trails that no one else could see, looking for the men and women who had stood on that ridge and watched Kalia Riven die and laughed. The Dominion officers who had filmed her last breath, who had turned her final act of mercy into a cruel joke. They hunted those officers with a precision that felt less like vengeance and more like ritual. Their ship was a patchwork scout class, long decommissioned, salvaged from the graveyards of orbital scrapyards, with engines that whine like ghosts and a hull marked with weld scars and scavenged armor. They called it the last silence, and it moved like a rumor, undetectable, unregistered, and unstoppable. They never attacked from above, they never stormed in with force. They waited, they watched, they studied every patrol pattern, every supply schedule, every idle conversation. They listened to private feeds and intercepted transmissions, and when they struck it was always clean, always surgical, always final. The first officer was taken on a diplomatic run just outside the Vesta cluster. He never arrived. His ship was found days later, power cells intact, life support running, dinner still warm, and no sign of struggle, only his boots left at the airlock and the words "we remember" written across the observation glass. The second officer went missing mid-inspection aboard a Dominion flagship, hundreds of personnel aboard. Not one saw anything, just a missing helmet and a set of combat gloves on the floor outside the engine room. Someone reviewed the logs, but the video had been replaced with old funeral footage from Kairos 8 on loop. The third was found floating in low orbit, his pod pristine, untouched, oxygen full, systems green, but his eyes frozen wide up, and a field tag pressed into his chest, the initials CR etched into the edge by hand. And now the Dominion knew this was not random, this was personal, and it terrified them because they realized they had no defense against belief. They had weapons, they had shields, they had fleets, but they had no shield for memory, no armor against meaning. The squad did not speak, they did not broadcast, they did not threaten, they left no survivors and no explanations, only symbols and silence. Their presence spread through Dominion space like myth, like something ancient and inevitable. Officers began refusing assignments that placed them near Kairos 8 even after the region had been declared pacified. Some requested reassignment to border patrols, to mining colonies, to anywhere that did not carry the weight of history. One Dominion captain resigned mid-command and left a single note scrawled into his personal log: "You can kill a soldier, but you cannot silence a vow." The Dominion tried to deny the disappearances, tried to pin them on deserters, on pirates, on internal unrest, but their own people were not convinced. Fear does not need truth, it only needs repetition, and the stories were everywhere, whispered by technicians over wiring panels passed between guards at night, told in fragments aboard supply freighters. They say the gravediggers are not even alive anymore. One story goes they are just data ghosts uploaded into ship code, another says they are clones grown from Kalia's blood, trained only for vengeance. One crew swears they saw the last silence pass through a meteor field without altering course, flying through solid rock like it was not even there, and yet the Dominion kept losing officers, losing ground not in battles but in whispers and rumors and erosion, and even their civilians began asking questions. Why did the disappearances only happen to people who were present at the funeral? Why did the government refuse to show the full footage? Why did the name Kalia Riven suddenly vanish from the archives? University professor published an anonymous paper assing patterns in military resource reallocation, linking them to Dominion war crimes. The paper was pulled offline within hours. The professor was not seen again, but copies of the report leaked into resistance channels, and from there into neutral space, and from there into Earth. And then things began to change, because Earth had still not spoken, not a single official transmission, not a single word of confirmation, and yet the effects were undeniable. More Dominion ships abandoned, more bases empty, more officers afraid to close their eyes at night because they feared what memory might bring. The squad did not stop because they were not done. The promise had not yet been fulfilled. There were still names on the list, and the silence was still ringing across the stars, and somewhere in the deep dark where no stars reached, the last silence drifted between planets like a prayer, like a threat, and the three soldiers aboard it did not sleep, did not laugh, did not forget. They sharpened their focus and prepared for the next name on the list, a name that led directly to the Dominion High Command, and they would not stop until every name was answered. And so they plotted their course, not to strike with rage but with resolve, and the silence followed behind them like a wave waiting to break. The deeper they moved into Dominion territory, the colder the trail became, because those who had laughed at Kairos 8 had begun to vanish, not from death, not from punishment, but from the very records that once protected them. Names that once echoed through fleets with rank and title were being stripped from command boards, reclassified, relocated, erased, and those doing the erasing were not humans. They were Dominion officers trying to save themselves from memory by burying it under silence, but it was too late. The silence no longer belonged to them, it belonged to us, and every attempt to hide their sins only proved they remembered what they had done and what was coming. And still the squad moved forward, always unseen, always one step behind the truth. They were not chasing ghosts, they were following the echo of injustice, and they would follow it into the darkest corners of space if it meant keeping the vow they made on that scorched field when they buried Kalia Riven in the dust and swore to remember what others had. Odd at the crew of the last silence had not spoken aloud in months. Words were not needed. The mission was clear, and every breath they took was just another step toward completion. Their ship drifted past long-forgotten mining outposts, each one marked by abandonment and eerie stillness, and each one scanned for signs of hidden files or surviving logs. In one they found a cache of intercepted Dominion transmissions filtered through black site encryption, and buried beneath sensor logs was a voice print matched to one of the commanders who had stood on the ridge at Kairos 8. He had not been seen since the second cycle after the execution, and official records stated he had died in a training accident, but the logs told another story. They traced him to a secret station orbiting a collapsed star, one so far off the grid it did not appear on any known star maps. The silence changed course without pause, and the crew prepared not with weapons but with remembrance, each memory sharpened into intent, each loss carried like a blade. The station was cold and quiet but not dead. It was humming with life and darkness, both its hallways wide and smooth and eerily clean, its walls lined with emblems that had not been used in decades, and as they moved through the corridors one by one, lights flickered on as if the station itself knew they had come not to fight but to judge. The first chamber was filled with data cores, and in them names, hundreds of names, all former Dominion officers, all marked inactive or missing, and next to each was a red tag tag labeled classified relocation. None were dead. They had simply been erased, not to protect them from enemies but to protect the Dominion from history. And in that moment the crew understood something deeper than vengeance, something more dangerous than rage. They realized this was not just about Kalia, this was about every human who had been silenced, every soldier whose sacrifice was mocked, every medic whose mercy had been twisted into a weakness. This was about the soul of memory itself, and they would not let it rot. Behind walls of digital eyes, the central core of the station contained the last location of the man they sought. He was not dead, he was not even hiding, he was waiting. And when the doors opened and he saw who stood before him, he did not beg, he did not fight, he only said one thing: "You remember?" And for the first time in years the leader of the squad spoke aloud, his voice low, steady and clear. He said, "Yes, we remember." And then silence filled the chamber again, not from fear but from fulfillment. They did not kill him, not out of mercy but because he was already erased, and death would have given him closure. Instead they took everything, every file, every log, every secret, and they transmitted it to the galaxy wide open, with no encryption, no filters, no delay. The Dominion's own lies, their mockery, their crimes now lit up the skies of every connected world, and what the Dominion had tried to bury became the very light that exposed them. The fallout was immediate. Entire systems severed ties with Dominion. Leadership, citizens rioted, military officers defected, and everywhere people began whispering that humans do not forget, that humans do not let death pass unnoticed, that humans do not bury alone, and above all that humans remember in the way that matters, in the way that burns. The squad left the station as silently as they had arrived, their mission incomplete but their message clear, and across neutral space rebels and refugees and outcasts began to rally, not with flags or fleets but with memory. They began marking their homes with shovels scratched into the walls. They lit candles beside photos of the lost. They shared the story of Kalia Riven and the squad who never stopped walking toward truth, and the silence that once mocked us now belonged to us completely. And for the first time the Dominion was truly afraid, not because we were loud but because we were no longer afraid to be quiet. And the crew of the last silence turned toward their next destination, a Dominion archive world where the name of Kalia Riven had once been wiped from history, and prepared not to erase but to rewrite. The archive world was built into a moon that never rotated, a place locked in perpetual twilight where neither light nor shadow could fully take hold. It was not a battlefield, not a fortress, not a command center. It was something far older and far more dangerous. It was memory frozen in code, layered in steel and guarded not by soldiers but by silence, not the quiet of peace but the quiet of fear. The Dominion called it the Veil, and they said it did not exist. It held the records that were never supposed to be found, the names that were never supposed to be spoken, the truths that could unmake the myths of empires. And it was here that the last silence came, not to destroy but to reveal. The ship touched down with no signal, no warning. The air was thin and cold, the sky dull silver, and the towers of the Veil rose like blades of forgotten time. The three soldiers did not wear insignia, they carried no flags, no colors, only the memory of what brought them here. They walked across the frost-coated platform, and the gates of the archive opened before them, not because they were welcome but because the Veil knew the time for hiding was over. The entrance hall was miles wide, lined with statues of faceless figures holding scrolls that glowed with artificial fire. Each step echoed like it was falling through history, and at the center of the chamber a terminal rose from the floor, ancient and humming with life and resistance. The squad approached and placed Kalia Riven's field tag on the console. The machine paused and began to shift as if awakening from centuries of guilt. Lights flickered, pathways opened, and data began to pour into the air around them. Names, files, footage, everything the Dominion had taken from the world now returned in full color and terrible clarity. They saw Kalia's name again for the first time since it had been erased. It sat beside her record of service marked with honors and commendations, and above all mercy. Dozens of Dominion officers had filed requests for aid, and she had answered them all, not just humans, not just allies, but even those who once raised weapons against her. Because she did not see enemies, she saw wounds and pain and duty, and that was what made her dangerous. That was what the Dominion feared more than weapons. The crew moved deeper into the archive, following the stream of truth that poured from every corridor. As they passed each chamber a story unfolded, stories of civilians massacred in the name of peace, of prisoners executed under the veil of diplomacy, of aid ships denied entry to Dominion space because they carried human medics. The deeper they walked, the more the truth weighed on them, not as shame but as fuel, because now they understood that their mission was not about revenge or even redemption. It was about rebalancing the truth. It was about ensuring that those who mocked memory could never again write history in their favor. At the core of the archive was a sphere suspended in gravity, a data vault sealed with quantum locks and protected by an artificial intelligence older than the current Dominion government. The crew did not break, and they simply stood in front of it and placed the second tag, the chaplains, and they waited, and after a long moment the sphere opened, and within it they found the full record of Cairo's 8, unedited, raw, and impossible to deny. The final minutes of the funeral, the laughter, the gunfire, the faces, the voices, the moment Kalia collapsed trying to protect the very people who now ruled in silence. The footage streamed across systems in real-time, broadcast through stolen comm lines, pirated relay stations, hacked transport satellites. It reached not just Dominion territory but neutral worlds and even human colonies that had begun to doubt their own story, and the silence that followed was different. This silence was not fear, this silence was awe, grief awakening, and truth rising. The Dominion tried to shut it down, but the data had already been copied, the images already stored, the words already spoken, and the people began to react, not with riots, not with screams, but with symbols. They painted shovels on walls, they left field tags at Dominion checkpoints, they whispered Kalia's name like a prayer, and the crew knew they had done what no fleet could do. They had made people remember, and with memory came change. The crew of the last silence uploaded every file from the veil, every truth, every death, every act of kindness erased by politics, and they marked the final message with one line: this is not vengeance, this is memory. And with that the archive began to collapse, not from fire, not from bombs, but from its own inability to contain the truth any longer. As the crew returned to their ship, they did not look back. They did not need to, because they knew what they left behind would burn brighter than any flame. And the last silence turned away from the moon that held the veil and plotted a new course toward the outer Dominion systems, where fresh officers were still being trained, where the next generation was being told lies, and the crew knew they had to reach them before the silence became forgotten, before the truth was buried again. And as the stars bent around their path, the crew prepared not for war but for the next memory that needed to be reclaimed. The outer Dominion systems were polished clean on the surface, shining cities lined with silver and light, designed not to reflect truth but to blind from it. These were the academy worlds where the future of the Dominion was trained and shaped, where cadets learned obedience, not courage, and loyalty, not conscience, where history was not taught but rewritten, and the name Kalia Riven had never been spoken. The record said Cairo's 8 was a failed human negotiation, that the Dominion had offered peace and the humans had turned to violence, that the funeral had been a propaganda display and the humans fired first. But now something had changed. The students had seen the transmission from the veil, some in secret, others by accident, but once seen it could not be unseen, and the questions began to spread. Slow at first, whispered between dormitories, passed through encrypted notes during tactical drills. Some cadets found the footage burned onto illegal data disks slipped under their bunk, others found their holopads locked for a few minute with one phrase, "we remember," and then suddenly cleared again. The instructors tried to dismiss it as rebellion, as foreign subversion, but the silence around the topic only made it spread faster, because the silence had become familiar. The silence meant the Dominion was hiding something again, and memory always finds a way through. One cadet named Selvadrin, ranked first in her year, found a copy embedded in the code of her navigation simulation, and when she watched the full video from Cairo's 8, she did not speak for hours. She did not eat. She sat in the mess hall staring at her tray until the others noticed her and they asked her if she was all right, and she said, "Do you believe in ghosts?" And they laughed, but they stopped laughing when she showed them the feed, the real one, and for the first time they did not know what to say. And later that night they painted a small shovel under their academy insignia where no one else could see it, but they would know, and more did the same with an A. Week. An entire floor of the academy had stopped attending morning lectures. Instead they sat in the dark reviewing fragments of human transmission, tracing every erased file they could find, every censored name, every redacted line, and they formed something new. Not rebellion, not yet, not a mutiny, not quite, but a fracture, a fault line beneath the gleaming surface of the Dominion. And the instructors reported them, but the reports were ignored, because by then the top brass was too busy trying to explain why outer supply routes alerts were going silent and Wi-Fi high officers had vanished from a command retreat with no trace and no distress call and left only 3 field tags and the mark of a shovel burned into a stone table. The last silence had not struck in weeks, but that was the point. It did not need to. Its message had spread through memory, and now memory was doing the work, and as Selvadrin and her peers dug deeper they discovered something worse than lies. They discovered half-truths carefully engineered to twist empathy into obedience, to make young officers believe that justice was weakness, that showing mercy was failure, that burying the dead was a distraction, and that truth was whatever kept the Dominion strong. But now they had seen what truth really looked like, and they could not go back, and the instructors could sense the shift. They tried new drills, new punishments, isolation, reduction, interrogation, but the more they pushed the more the cadets withdrew, and one night the academy lights flickered and died, and when backup power returned a symbol had been burned into the wall of the command center, a shovel glowing white etched into the metal, and beneath it 3 words: "She did not surrender," and below that a name: Collier Riven. The head instructor requested immediate evacuation, but command denied it because they did not understand what was happening. They thought it was terrorism, they thought it was an external threat, but this was not coming from outside, this was coming from inside, and it was not a threat, it was a memory. And that was what made it unstoppable, because it meant something. And even as reinforcements were deployed to the academy, even as communications were locked and backups purged, the damage had already been done, because now memory was growing in places the Dominion could not reach, not with weapons, not with propaganda. It was growing in whispers and shadows and symbols, and the last silence watched from afar, the crew standing at the edge of Dominion space, not interfering, not striking, not yet, just watching, just remembering. And the captain nodded once, as if the timing was right, as if the next step had finally revealed itself, and they turned toward a signal, not military, not official, but from the cadets themselves, a transmission buried in a training simulation. 5 words: "We are ready to remember," and with that the crew set a new course, not to destroy, not to kill, but to teach, because memory is not just about justice, it is about awakening. And the silence that followed them was no longer warning, it was invitation. And as the last silence disappeared into the drift toward the academy, the stars behind them blinked like eyes wide open and waiting. The academy stood frozen, not from cold or fear, but from the weight of realization. It had been designed as a forge for obedience, a factory that pressed young minds into loyal shapes, where orders mattered more than reason and victory mattered more than truth. But now that design was fracturing, because memory had entered the structure not as a bomb, not as a bullet, but as something far more dangerous, a story. And stories are living things, they grow, they spread, they echo. And in the silence that followed the appearance of the symbol in the command center, a single question began to bloom in every cadet who had seen the footage. What else have they lied about? That question was not loud, but it was unrelenting. It followed them into every lecture, into every simulation, into every moment of stillness, and one by one cadets began turning away from the instructors, not defiantly, not violently, just quietly, as if they were stepping out of a dream. They did not shout, they did not march, they simply remembered. And in remembering they began reprogramming their drills, not to strike first but to protect civilians. They rewrote target identification software to flag humanitarian signals as do not engage. They wrote Collier Riven's name into the medic protocols where it had once been erased. And more than anything, they began to listen, not to the loudest voices, not to the most decorated officers, but to the silence between commands. And in that silence they began to find themselves again. And then the last silence arrived, not in formation, not with alarms. It simply appeared one morning, docked at Bay 17, where no ships were scheduled, no records listed its entry, no cameras recorded its descent, but there it was, and the cadets who had sent the signal were already waiting. No orders were exchanged, no plans were laid. They walked aboard like they already knew the shape of what was to come, and the crew did not speak, they only nodded, and the cadets followed them through the narrow halls of the old ship, past steel that had seen fire and void, past bulkheads etched with names of the fallen and memories unspoken. And when they reached the central chamber they found not weapons but stories, videos, files, logs of the war as it had really happened. And as they watched those truths their training began to unravel, not because they had been fools but because they had been taught to forget, and now they were choosing to remember. And the instructors sounded the alarm, locked the gates, activated emergency protocols, but none of it mattered because the cadets were already beyond their reach, not in space, not in distance, resistance but in mind, and once memory takes root no gate can hold it, and the ship lifted without resistance because the launch codes had already been rewritten by the ones who no longer believed in lies. And as the last silence carried its new passengers into the drift, the academy below fell still, not in defeat but in pause, as if it knew it had been seen and could no longer look away. And across the Dominion other academies began to report anomalies, students refusing CERTA, in simulations training modules failing to execute properly, instructors unable to explain gaps in knowledge because those gaps were not errors, they were intentions, new intentions built by cadets who had seen what came before and refused to repeat it. And the Dominion scrambled to control the narrative again, but this time their silence betrayed them, because now everyone knew what it meant when the Dominion said nothing. It meant there was truth in the story, and the story was spreading like sunrise through fog. And the last silence continued its path, not as a ship, not as a squad, but as a question echoing across every system. What would you do if you remembered? And in the neutral zones where traitors and diplomats once avoided speaking of Cairo's 8 small markers began to appear, shovels drawn into the dust, medics leaving field kits where no one had requested them, civilian freighters changing course to assist human colonies that had not sent a distress call but needed help nonetheless. And the memory of Kalia Rivnbika, me not just a symbol of loss but a standard for a new kind of resistance, one that did not need guns to begin. And the Dominion felt it like a crack in the glass of their authority spreading slowly but without end. And the council met in silence behind their fortified doors, behind walls layered in digital firewalls and protocol and fear, and they whispered about the ghost ship, the one that never appeared on scanners, the one that left symbols not bodies. And they asked each other, what happens when a story cannot be stopped? And none of them had an answer because they had never believed in the power of remembering, and now they were beginning to understand it too late. And far from their towers, the cadets aboard the last silence gathered in a circle around the old crew who had seen it all, and together they began to write not a mission log, not an operation plan, but something older, something stronger. They began to write names, names of the fallen, names of the forgotten, names of those who had stood for truth and died in silence. And when the last name was written, they stood, and one of the cadets spoke, not loud, not proud, just certain. She said, now we carry them forward. And the lights of the ship dimmed as if bowing to that truth, and the last silence turned again, its engines humming low, its path aimed not at war but at the next memory waiting to be reclaimed. And in the dark between stars something ancient stirred, not a fleet, not a weapon, but the world, a place the Dominion had hidden from even its own leaders. And now the silence was heading there, drawn by a whisper from the past that had never truly stopped calling. The whisper came from a world that was not on any map, not listed in any Dominion archive, not marked by any star path, a world thought dead, forgotten, burned out during the early cycles of expansion. It had no official name, just an old code reference, Echo 13, a planet left behind during the border wars when both Dominion and human forces declared it uninhabitable due to radiation. But that was a lie, not just an exaggeration, not just a cover story, a full engineered fabrication. The planet was not dead, it was sleeping, and now something was waking it up. The last silence received the signal embedded in a forgotten comm band buried beneath layers of static and false data, and the moment the crew decrypted it, they knew where they were going, they knew what had to be done. The cadets aboard the ship did not question, they understood. Now the questions came after memory, not before, and the journey to Echo 13 was long, not in distance but in weight, because they could feel what waited for them. At the end they could feel the gravity of what had been buried and wide. The silence of the ship deepened as they approached, a silence not of fear but of preparation. And when they arrived they found a sky choked in gray, a landscape of scorched stone and fractured mountains, the ruins of old listening posts long collapsed, and beneath it all the faint pulse of something alive, not biological, not mechanical, something else, something old. The planet had once hosted one of the original Joint Command outposts, a rare alliance between early human pioneers and fringe Dominion defectors built to study an ancient signal source, one that predated both empires. But when the alliances broke, when trust shattered, the Dominion raised the facility and told the stars it never existed. The signal stopped her and the world was sealed under lies. But now the signal had returned, and the last silence followed it through valleys of forgotten metal, across wastelands scorched by the weight of stories untold, until they found the tower black and half sunken into the stone single light still blinking above the hatch, not bright, not urgent, just patient, the way memory always is. And inside they found her, not Kalia Riven, not in body but in code, her voice, her logs, her final transmissions before Kairos 8, copied and stored by a friend, a technician who died, sealing the data behind walls no one was meant to open. And now the walls were open and her voice echoed through the chamber, not as a ghost but as a guide. She had recorded everything, not just the funeral, not just the execution, but her warnings, her suspicions, her doubts about the Dominion and the Council, and the patterns of power that led to betrayal. She had seen it coming and no one had listened, but now her words rang like truth, and the cadets stood in silence as they listened to every syllable, not because they were ordered to but because they understood that some stories demand to be heard. And when the recordings ended, the room fell still, and then the lights in the tower began to shift, showing corridors, long sealed data banks, long of flying, all waking up as if her memory had reactivated the truth, and they began to uncover more, not just about Kairos 8 but about the first days of the war, about orders rewritten to justify slaughter, about peace offers buried beneath pride and fear. And now the crew saw clearly that this was not a single injustice, not one battlefield, not one betrayal. This was a pattern, this was the shape of forgetting, and their mission was not revenge, it was recovery. And they began to transmit the files again, this time in bursts across 100 civilian comm lines, relays and satellites hidden throughout forgotten sectors. They did not care who heard, they only cared that someone didn't. The Dominion scrambled to respond, but it was too late. The stories were loose again, the truth was blooming again, and people listened because the voice of Kalia Riven was not angry, not bitter, it was honest, and honesty is the most dangerous force in any empire. And the last silence left Echo 13 not in haste but with purpose, because now they had more than memory, they had a map, and the next location was clear: a Dominion data citadel buried within the command world itself, a fortress where the final erasure had been done, where Kalia Riven's name had been deleted officially and forever, and that was where they would go, not to recover her but to make sure she could never be erased again. And as the ship bent toward its next destination, the stars shifted and the void opened, and something old followed them, something that had been waiting for the truth to rise again, something that did not wear armor or command fleets but watched from beneath the surface of things, waiting for a story strong enough to tear silence apart. The whisper came from a world that was not on any map, not listed in any Dominion archive, not marked by any star path, a world thought dead, forgotten, burned out during the early cycles of expansion. It had no official name, just an old code reference: Echo 13, a planet left behind during the border wars when both Dominion and human forces declared it uninhabitable due to radiation. But that was a lie, not just an exaggeration, not just a cover story, a full engineered fabrication. The planet was not dead, it was sleeping, and now something was waking it up. The last silence received the signal embedded in a forgotten comm band buried beneath layers of static and false data, and the moment the crew decrypted it, they knew where they were going, they knew what had to be done. The cadets aboard the ship did not question, they understood. Now the questions came after memory, not before, and the journey to Echo 13 was long, not in distance but in weight, because they could feel what waited for them. At the end they could feel the gravity of what had been buried, and why the silence of the ship deepened as they approached, a silence not of fear but of preparation. And when they arrived they found a sky choked in grey, a landscape of scorched stone and fractured mountains, the ruins of old listening posts long collapsed, and beneath it all the faint pulse of something alive, not biological, not mechanical, something else, something old. The planet had once hosted one of the original Joint Command outposts, a rare alliance between early human pioneers and fringe Dominion defectors built to study an ancient signal source, one that predated both empires. But when the alliances broke, when trust shattered, the Dominion raised the facility and told the stars it never existed. The signal stopped her and the world was sealed under lies. But now the signal had returned, and the last silence followed it, through valleys of forgotten metal, across wastelands scorched by the weight of stories untold, until they found the tower black and half sunken into the stone single light still blinking above the hatch, not bright, not urgent, just patient, the way memory always is. And inside they found her, not Kalia Riven, not in body but in code, her voice, her logs, her final transmissions before Kairos 8, copied and stored by a friend, a technician who died, sealing the data behind walls no one was meant to open. And now the walls were open and her voice echoed through the chamber, not as a ghost but as a guide. She had recorded everything, not just the funeral, not just just the execution but her warnings, her suspicions, her doubts about the Dominion and the Council and the patterns of power that led to betrayal. She had seen it coming and no one had listened, but now her words rang like truth and the cadets stood in silence as they listened to every syllable, not because they were ordered to but because they understood that some stories demand to be heard. And when the recordings ended, the room fell still, and then the lights in the tower began to shift, showing corridors, long sealed databanks, long of Flynn all waking up as if her memory had reactivated the truth, and they began to uncover more, not just about Kairos 8 but about the first days of the war, about orders rewritten to justify slaughter, about peace offers buried beneath pride and fear. And now the crew saw clearly that this was not a single injustice, not one battlefield, not one betrayal. This was a pattern, this was the shape of forgetting, and their mission was not revenge, it was recovery. And they began to transmit the files again, this time in bursts across 100 civilian comm lines, relays and satellites hidden throughout forgotten sectors. They did not care who heard, they only cared that someone didn't. The Dominion scrambled to respond, but it was too late. The stories were loose again, the truth was blooming again, and people listened because the voice of Collier Riven was not angry, not bitter, it was honest, and honesty is the most dangerous force in any empire. And the last silence left Echo 13 not in haste but with purpose, because now they had more than memory, they had the map, and the next location was clear: a Dominion data citadel buried within the command world itself, a fortress where the final erasure had been done, where Collier Riven's name had been deleted officially and forever, and that was where they would go, not to recover her but to make sure she could never be erased again. And as the ship bent toward its next destination, the stars shifted and the void opened, and something old followed them, something that had been waiting for the truth to rise again, something that did not wear armor or command fleets but watched from beneath the surface of things, waiting for a story strong enough to tear silence apart. The stars have always watched us, but we rarely watched them back, not really, not with understanding, not with reverence. We crossed the void, we built ships and claimed borders, we painted flags on moons and said this belongs to us, but the stars were never ours. They were witnesses, and now they remember, because the silence has returned, not the ship, not the squad, but the silence itself, the one that came before the Dominion, before Earth, before even memory, and it is waking not in violence but in presence, because something ancient has stirred, something that watched from the corners of forgotten light, something that once whispered into the minds of early dreamers, and now it is listening again, because the truth we send across the galaxy has not only reached people, it has reached places, places that should not be listening, places that remember before remembering was even language, and from one of those places a signal has come back, not human, not Dominion, but shaped in the exact rhythm of Collier Riven's last breath, a breath recorded by the crew and stored in silence for years, a breath that now echoes across systems, not as sound but as light, and the last silence has heard it, and they know this is the end, not of the story, not of the fight, but of the forgetting, and they turn their ship not toward battle, not toward vengeance, but toward the edge of everything, where the signal waits, where the stars no longer map clean, where coordinates bend and laws fail, and they go without hesitation, because they understand now that memory is not just about what was lost but what was waiting to be found. And as they approach the edge of known space, the crew gathers, not to plan, not to fight, but to listen, because the signal is not calling them to war, it is calling them home. And on this final transmission they leave behind, they do not speak, they do not explain, they simply broadcast the names, all the names spoken aloud one by one in the voice of a cadet who was not even born when the war began. And the voice does not tremble, the voice does not hurry, it speaks each name with the weight it deserves, and then it stops, and the silence that follows is absolute. And all across the stars people pause, not because they are told to but because they feel it, because for the first time in a generation the silence means peace, not erasure, not fear, but peace, the peace that comes after truth, after justice, after remembrance. And as the last silence vanishes into the unknown, the people do not cheer, they do not cry, they light candles, they etch symbols into stone, they leave shovels at the base of old statues, and they whisper her name, not because they are told to, not because it is law, but because they remember. And the Dominion does not fall in a single day, it unravels slowly like smoke in a sealed room, unable to escape its own lies. And the Council tries to adapt, tries to rebrand, tries to reclaim the story, but it is too late. The story is no longer theirs, it belongs to the people, it belongs to the stars, and the stars remember everything, and far beyond the reach of politics and fleets in a plaque. Where silence has never been broken, the last silence arrives, and what they find is not a threat, not an enemy, not a god. It is a mirror, not of who they are but of who they were, and it shows them every face, every voice, every loss and every love, and it says nothing because it does not have to, and they understand, and they stay, not to rule, not to retreat, but to guard the memory, to keep it from being buried again. And the legend of the last silence spreads not as fear but as faith, not as shadow but as light, and every time someone tries to erase the truth, the transmission plays, not loud, not long, just a single voice saying we remember, and that is all it takes now, because the silence is everywhere and it belongs to us now, and no empire, no council, no weapon will ever erase it again.